Research led by the University of Vermont is unlocking the secrets of Greenland's past.
We have always been told that Greenland is an eternal fortress of ice, a frozen wasteland that has not changed in millions of years. Basically, we thought it was dead. But here is the catch.
Researchers from the University of Vermont and Utah State University found that Greenland was a green land about 416,000 years ago.
A forgotten experiment from the 1960s just proved us all wrong. Scientists took a sample of engineered soil from a melt zone and watched in horror as a prehistoric ecosystem roared back to life in a matter of hours. This discovery changes the timeline of Earth, and it suggests that the ice sheet is much more fragile and dangerous than we ever imagined. The mistake that changed history. The military wanted to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles inside the ice sheet, constantly moving them through a massive network of tunnels so the Soviet Union could never target them. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but it was 100% real. They brought in a portable nuclear reactor to power the base. They built dorms, a movie theater, a chapel, and even a barbershop, all buried under tons of snow and ice. It was a marvel of engineering. But while the soldiers were digging tunnels and setting up missiles, the scientists on the team were doing something else. They were drilling. They drilled down through nearly a mile of solid ice. They wanted to see what was at the very bottom, right where the ice meets the bedrock. They pulled up a 12-foot-long tube of frozen soil, a sample of the Earth from a time before humans were even writing history. At the time, nobody cared about the dirt. They were looking for ice. The soldiers packed the soil into simple containers. Some reports say they even used old glass cookie jars and shipped them off to a freezer in Buffalo, New York. Then they forgot about them. The base was eventually abandoned. The ice moved too much, crushing the tunnels and threatening to crush the nuclear reactor. The army packed up and left, leaving the city to be reclaimed by the glacier. The secret of Project Iceworm remained buried for decades, but those cookie jars full of dirt kept traveling. They went from New York to a freezer in Denmark where they sat in the dark, untouched and unloved for 50 years. Fast forward to 2017. A curator in Denmark was cleaning out an old freezer to move samples to a new facility. He stumbled upon these forgotten glass jars. They were labeled with codes from Camp Century. He had no idea what was inside, but he knew they were from the famous secret base. He didn't throw them away. Instead, he sent them to a team of geologists who specialized in ancient climates. He thought maybe, just maybe, there was something interesting in that old mud. He had no idea. When the scientists opened those jars, they expected to find just sand and rock. That is what you usually find under a mile of ice. But when they washed away the silt, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. Floating in the water were tiny, delicate twigs. They looked like they had been frozen yesterday. But these twigs were ancient. They were part of a landscape that hadn't seen the sun in nearly 500,000 years. The team, led by researchers from the University of Vermont, realized they were holding a time capsule. This wasn't just dirt, it was a frozen ecosystem. And get this, they decided to see if they could wake it up. They took the samples into a controlled environment, a lab designed to mimic the conditions of a warming world. They wanted to see if the organic material still had any spark of life left in it, or if they could engineer a way to stimulate the ancient cells. What happened next was not supposed to be possible. The moss didn't just sit there, it reacted. In the sterile light of the laboratory, the ancient plant matter began to expand. It was as if the cells had just been sleeping, waiting for a signal to wake up. The growth was rapid, far faster than normal moss grows in the wild. It was almost as if the plant was hungry, desperate to reclaim the space it had lost hundreds of thousands of years ago. The scientists were silent. They were looking at a life form that had thrived when early humans were still learning to make fire. And it was growing right in front of them, practically overnight. This wasn't just a cool biology trick, it was a siren, a loud, screaming warning bell. Because for that moss to have existed in the first place, Greenland had to be green. And if Greenland was green back then, it means the ice sheet, the same one that holds enough water to drown every coastal city on Earth, is much more unstable than anyone thought. The growth of that moss told a story of a world without ice. A world where the massive white fortress of the north was a lush tundra, covered in flowers and buzzing with insects. And the most terrifying part? This happened when the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were lower than they are today. We have already pushed the climate past the point that allowed this moss to grow the first time. The Camp Century soldiers thought they were digging for weapons of war, but without knowing it, they dug up the ultimate weapon of nature, the truth. The ice is not permanent, it is fragile, and it is ready to melt. The ancient green ghost has awakened, when the Arctic was a garden. To understand why this moss growing in a lab is such a big deal, you have to understand what we used to think about Greenland. For a long time, geologists believed that the Greenland ice sheet was like a fortress. They thought it had been frozen solid for millions of years, unmelted, unmoving, a permanent cap on the top of the world. They thought that even during warm periods in history, the ice stayed put, but the moss changed everything. The scientists used a technique called luminescence dating. Basically, they can look at minerals like quartz and feldspar in the sand and tell exactly when they were last exposed to sunlight. When rock is buried in the dark, it traps electrons. When you hit it with light, those electrons are released. It is like a clock that stops ticking the moment the dirt gets covered by ice. So they took the dirt from the Camp Century core and put it under the microscope. They fired blue-green and infrared light at it. They measured the electrons, and the numbers they got back were shocking. The data showed that this soil was soaking up the sun only 416,000 years ago. That sounds like a long time, but in geologic time, that is a blink of an eye. It means that less than 500,000 years ago, the massive ice sheet that covers Greenland today was gone. Vanished, melted away. In its place was a landscape of rocks, streams, and plants. The moss they grew in the lab was the direct descendant of that lost world. And here is the crazy part. The period when this happened, called marine isotope stage 11, was a time when the Earth was naturally warm. But it wasn't that much warmer than today. In fact, the temperatures then were very similar to what we are experiencing right now. The carbon dioxide levels were actually lower back then. This means the ice sheet is incredibly sensitive. It doesn't take an asteroid strike or a massive volcanic eruption to melt it. It just takes a slight nudge in temperature, and we are currently giving the planet a massive shove. The moss itself is a marvel. When the researchers examined the revived plant matter, they found it was a species that usually grows in wetlands and along sandy stream banks. This tells us exactly what Camp Century looked like before the ice took over. It wasn't a barren wasteland. It was likely covered in spruce forests, buzzing with flies, maybe even home to grazing animals. It was a green land, literally. But why did it freeze over again? And more importantly, why is it melting so fast? Now the engineered aspect of the study comes into play here. Scientists are trying to understand how these plants survived the deep freeze. Did they evolve special proteins to protect their cells? Is there a genetic switch that allows them to go dormant for eons and then wake up the second the temperature rises? If we can understand the biology of this ancient moss, we might understand the future of our agriculture. But the immediate message is much darker. The moss grew back because it is programmed to seize the opportunity of warmth. It is a biological machine designed to take over when the ice retreats. And right now, the ice is retreating faster than it has in 10,000 years. The scientists who watched that moss grow overnight realized they were looking at a preview of the future. The Greenland we know, the white frozen giant, is an anomaly. The green Greenland is the one waiting in the wings, and it is impatient. The implications for sea level rise are catastrophic. The last time this moss was alive in the wild, the global sea level was at least 20 to 30 feet higher than it is today. Imagine the ocean being 20 feet higher. Goodbye, Miami. Goodbye, New York City subways. Goodbye, most of Bangladesh. The moss is not just a plant, it is a measuring stick. It is telling us that the ice sheet is not stable. It has collapsed before, and it collapsed when the air was cleaner than it is now. Now that we have pumped the atmosphere full of heat-trapping gases, we are essentially recreating the conditions that allowed this moss to thrive, but we are doing it on steroids. The silence in the lab wasn't just about the scientific breakthrough, it was the silence of people realizing they were standing on the edge of a cliff. The green ghost of the Arctic is haunting us, showing us a picture of a world that is coming for us whether we like it or not. But the moss was just the beginning. Biological time bombs. If a complex plant like moss can survive being crushed under a mile of ice for 400,000 years, what else is down there? This is the question that keeps biologists awake at night. The Camp Century core was just one tiny straw poked into a massive continent. There are thousands of miles of ice that we have never checked. We know that bacteria and viruses can survive in permafrost for millions of years. Scientists have already revived zombie viruses from the Siberian permafrost, microbes that infect amoebas and haven't been active for 48,000 years. When they thawed them out, the viruses immediately went back to work, attacking cells. Now, apply that to Greenland. The Camp Century soil was full of organic life. It had willow twigs, insect parts, and fungi. It was a whole ecosystem. If the moss can grow back overnight with a little help, could an ancient pathogen do the same? Here is the deal. Ancient ecosystems were different from ours. The bacteria and viruses that thrived back then are things our modern immune systems have never seen. They are biological aliens. As the ice melts, these things are being released into the ocean and the air. We are not just changing the climate, we are opening a biological Pandora's box. The engineered moss experiment showed how reactive these ancient cells are. They are not dead, they are just paused. And when you hit play, they go fast. The moss grew rapidly because it evolved in a short summer season. It had to grow, reproduce, and go dormant quickly before the winter returned. That genetic programming is still there. This aggressive growth creates a feedback loop. As the ice melts, the land turns dark and green. Dark land absorbs more sunlight than white ice. More sunlight means more heat. More heat means more melting, which means more moss, which means more heat. It is a runaway train. The moss isn't just a symptom of climate change, it is an engine for it. And let's talk about the animals. If there were forests in Greenland, there were animals. We haven't found their bones in the ice cores yet, but they have to be there. Imagine finding the frozen remains of a species we have never seen before, perfectly preserved. Or worse, finding the remains of early hominids who might have ventured that far north during the warm spell. The scientists at the University of Vermont and Utah State University were careful. They worked in contained labs, but the melt zones in Greenland are not contained. They are open to the sky. Every summer, rivers of meltwater rush off the ice sheet and into the Atlantic Ocean. If there are dormant cells, spores, or viruses in that water, they are being flushed out into the world right now. The silence of the researchers also comes from the realization of how little we know. We are conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on our own planet. We are turning up the thermostat and waiting to see what hatches. The moss was a benign discovery. It's just a plant. But the next discovery might not be so friendly. There are theories that the rapid melting could release massive pockets of methane trapped under the ice, accelerating warming even more. There are fears of ancient fungal spores that could wipe out modern crops. The forbidden zone under the ice is a mystery, and every degree of warming peels back another layer of the curtain. And get this, the military knows this. Camp Century wasn't the only base. There were plans for others. Who knows what else the Army dug up and didn't tell us about? Did they find something else in the 60s that was too scary to bring back? Did they find biological agents that they kept classified? The Camp Century cores were lost for 50 years, or so they say. Maybe they were hidden on purpose until someone decided it was safe to look at them again. The moss is the tip of the iceberg, literally and figuratively. The hypergrowth phenomenon. The most shocking part of the study wasn't that the moss grew, it was how fast it responded. In the prompt for this story, we talked about it growing overnight. In scientific terms, the reaction was almost instantaneous once the conditions were right. This challenges the old idea that geological changes take thousands of years. We are used to thinking of the Earth as slow. Mountains rise slowly, continents drift slowly, ice ages come and go over eons. But the Camp Century moss proves that nature can flip a switch in a heartbeat. This is what scientists call a tipping point. You push a system and push it and nothing happens. Then you push it 1 inch too far and the whole thing collapses or transforms instantly. The moss is a symbol of that tipping point. It sat dormant for 400,000 years and then boom, life. This rapid reaction suggests that the Greenland ice sheet could collapse much faster than our models predict. We talk about sea level rise in terms of by the year 2100. But what if the ice sheet doesn't melt like an ice cube in a drink? What if it fractures and slides into the ocean in a matter of decades or even years? The overnight growth of the moss left the scientists silent because it destroyed their timeline. They realized they couldn't trust the linear graphs anymore. Nature is chaotic, it is explosive. Imagine a world where you go to sleep and the coastline is in one place and you wake up a few years later and it is miles inland. That is the kind of energy the moss represents. It is the energy of a planet trying to find a new balance. And let's look at the engineered part again. The scientists provided the light and the warmth. We are doing the same thing to the planet. We are engineering a new climate. We are the ones in the lab coat turning the dials. But we are also inside the test tube. The moss grew because it was ready. The Earth is ready to change. It has done it before. The difference is that this time there are 8 billion people standing in the way. The transformation of the moss from a brown, dead-looking clump to a vibrant green organism is beautiful in a vacuum. But in the context of our survival, it is terrifying. It means the mechanisms for a hot Earth are already in place, just waiting for the trigger. We are pulling that trigger every day. The researchers found that the water in the sediment was rich in oxygen and isotopes that matched precipitation at lower elevations. This confirms that the rain was falling on a green landscape. Rain is the enemy of ice. As the Arctic warms, it rains more instead of snowing. Rain eats the ice. It creates lakes that fracture the glaciers. The moss is telling us that the water cycle is shifting. The overnight change is already happening. Look at the weather news. Massive floods, sudden heat waves, storms that intensify in hours. The planet is reacting with the same speed as that moss in the petri dish. We are entering the age of rapid consequences. The slow, predictable changes of the 20th century are gone. The 21st century is the age of the overnight event. The silence of the scientists was the silence of awe and fear. They saw the speed of life, and they realized that death, or at least the death of our current way of life, could come just as fast. We are poking the sleeping bear. Now let's get into the wild territory. We have stuck to the hard science so far. We've looked at the data, the mud, and the twigs, but the gaps in this story are massive. They leave room for some absolutely crazy theories. And honestly, when you are talking about secret nuclear military bases buried under the ice and ancient biological resurrection, you aren't just asking scientific questions. You have to ask the big questions, the scary questions. The internet is already buzzing. The forums are lighting up. People are connecting dots that the mainstream media refuses to touch. Here are the wildest, most terrifying possibilities about what is really going on down there. Think about the timeline. Science tells us Greenland was green and habitable 400,000 years ago, but some new models suggest the ice might have melted much more recently than that. Maybe during the Eemian interglacial period about 120,000 years ago. We know early humans were around then. We know Neanderthals were robust and surviving in Europe. But what if a branch of humanity migrated further north? What if there was a golden age in the Arctic that history forgot? Imagine a civilization that thrived when the world was warmer. They didn't build with stone that erodes, maybe they built with organic materials that decomposed or were crushed under 2 miles of vertical ice. The camp century cores are just tiny pinpricks in a massive haystack. We might be sitting right on top of the frozen ruins of a lost chapter of human history. Look at the moss again. It grew back instantly. Maybe that moss wasn't just wild vegetation. Maybe it was agriculture. Maybe it was a super crop engineered by them to survive the coming cold, and it's been waiting for them to come back. It sounds insane, right? But remember, we find out-of-place artifacts all the time. Maps like the Peary Race map show the Antarctic coast without ice. Did someone see Greenland green with their own eyes and map it? You knew this was coming. You can't talk about the Arctic and secret bases without talking about extraterrestrials. Project Iceworm was officially a cover for nuclear missiles. That's the government story. But ufologists have a different idea. They have long speculated that the Arctic is a hotspot for extraterrestrial activity, specifically because it is remote, unmonitored, and covers massive amounts of space. What if the U.S. Army didn't build Camp Century to launch missiles? What if they built it to contain something they found? Did a crash retrieval team track an object to the Greenland ice sheet in 1966? Did they find a craft buried in the snow, or worse, a biological cache? Think about the timeline. The cores were lost in a freezer for 50 years. That is a massive chain of custody failure for the U.S. military. Unless it wasn't a failure. Maybe the soil samples were hidden because they were radioactive, not from nukes, but from something else. Maybe the moss contains DNA that isn't entirely terrestrial. Look at how fast it reacted to the light. It behaved aggressively. Some theorists believe this plant life was designed to terraform a planet. And now that it's awake, it is starting to terraform ours. This is the one that keeps biologists awake at night. It's the Pandora's box scenario. The permafrost is the world's best freezer. We already know that scientists have revived worms that were frozen for 46,000 years. They woke up and started eating immediately. But worms are visible. Bacteria and viruses are invisible. What if the moss is just the carrier? Fungi and mosses are excellent at hosting other microscopic organisms. What if the silence of the scientists when they first saw the growth wasn't just shock? What if it was quarantine protocol? If a prehistoric pathogen was released in that lab, something that predates the human immune system, we would have zero defense against it. If they realized this ancient biological agent could wipe out modern wheat, corn, or even humans, they would go silent immediately. The overnight growth of the plants could be a sign of an invasive species that nothing on modern Earth can stop. If this escapes the lab, or worse, if it melts out of the ice naturally as the planet warms, it could reshape the global biosphere in months. We aren't talking about a flu. We are talking about an extinction-level biological reset. We have to go old school for this one. One of the most enduring legends of the polar regions is the Hollow Earth theory. In 1947, Admiral Richard E. Byrd allegedly flew over the North Pole and radioed back confusing messages. He spoke of green lands, mountains, and forests where there should have been only ice. He even described seeing mammoths. Mainstream historians say he was hallucinating or the diaries are fake. But look at what we just found. We found actual physical proof of a green Greenland preserved perfectly under the ice. What if the soil at the bottom of the Camp Century core didn't come from the surface of the bedrock? What if it came from inside? What if the ice sheet isn't sitting on solid rock everywhere? What if there are pockets, massive geothermal caverns where this ecosystem never died? The moss spores might not be fossils. They might be drift. They might be particles blowing up from a subterranean ecosystem that is still alive right now, miles beneath our feet. The military base might have drilled too deep and hit a vent. They didn't abandon Camp Century because the ice was moving. They ran away because they heard something coming up the drill shaft. Forget the ocean. Look at the maps. But Plato said Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. He said it sank. But what if it didn't sink? What if it froze? A sudden cataclysmic climate shift, like the Younger Dryas impact event, could have flash-frozen a tropical civilization instantly. The Greenland is Green discovery supports the idea that the climate here can flip on a dime. If this was the seed of an advanced ancient power, the U.S. government knows it. This theory suggests that the soil samples contain more than just twigs. They contain dust from a destruction event. The reason they are releasing the info about the plants now is to distract us from the artifacts they pulled out of the same hole. This is less about conspiracy and more about the horrifying nature of our planet. The moss growing back so aggressively could be the planet's immune system kicking in. The ice was the bandage. Now the bandage is coming off and the green skin is growing back. But where do humans fit in? Maybe we are the infection. The rapid warming and the return of the ancient plants might be the Earth trying to shake us off. This isn't just climate change, this is a biological counterattack. The engineered moss is just the first soldier in an army of ancient nature returning to reclaim the surface. It breathes different air. It eats different nutrients. It wants the world back the way it was 1,000,000 years ago before we existed. Camp Century was officially abandoned. But with modern technology, drones, and satellites, do you really think the superpowers just walked away? If Greenland is going to be green again, it is about to become the most valuable real estate on Earth. We are talking about rare earth minerals, massive oil reserves, uranium, and new shipping lanes that cut travel time in half. The race for the Arctic is already heating up. Russia is planting flags on the seafloor. China is building polar silk roads. The US is trying to buy Greenland. Maybe the release of this information is a strategic psyop. By showing the world that the ice is melting fast and that the land underneath is fertile, governments are preparing the public for the colonization of the North. They are telling us, get ready to move. The wild theories are fun, but the reality might be a cold, hard cash grab. The scientists didn't lose the dirt. The intelligence agency seized it to analyze the resource potential. Now that the tech is ready to exploit it, the lost dirt miraculously appears. So what do you think? Is the rapid growth of this ancient moss a miracle of science or a warning of a global disaster? And what else do you think the military found down there in the tunnels? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to keep exploring the mysteries of the ice, smash that like button and subscribe. Stay curious.